policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict, a conflict which we've been living with for a long time, but remains fascinating and urgent. And we're so pleased that Professor Freedman joins us again. Professor Freedman has been good enough to address this council on an average of at least every 3 or 4 years since its founding year. He first spoke here in 1981. Bob's a longtime friend of the council. He participated in discussions about this organization before it was even founded, and he's on our board of trustees now. He's well known within the Baltimore community, certainly, for his long tenure at the Baltimore Hebrew University. He's now a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins. And of course, he's known also for his national reputation as a political scientist and expert on the Middle East. He's the author of 4 books and 14 edited books and innumerable articles and comments. And flowing out from this very strong academic career over 4 decades now, I guess, comes the result of being a consultant at the State Department, a consultant with the CIA. He's lectured at the Israeli Foreign Ministry, the Israeli Foreign Defense Ministry, and he's a commentator that's highly respected, BBC, Public Radio, Voice of America, and other outlets. He's also been selected to be on a number of very interesting delegations, American delegations, which have gone to discuss these issues elsewhere in the world. He's talked with the major leaders of both the Palestinians and the Israelis over the year. He's been a serving president of the Association for Israel Studies here in the United States. It's a marvelous career, throughout which he's been dedicated and diligent, and has established a well-deserved reputation for excellence in the field of Russian-Israeli-American relations. It's an enormous pleasure for me to present Professor Robert O. Freedman.
Thank you very much, Frank. My mother would have loved the introduction. No question about it. It's really a pleasure to be back with everybody again here. And we have a topic this evening, I think, which is of some interest. That is the policy of our president, President Obama, toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. So what I'd like to do tonight is cover a number of things. First of all, talk about how Obama deliberately wanted to differentiate himself from George W. Bush. Then we'll talk about his initial goals for the Middle East, his first challenge, which was the election of Mr. Netanyahu, and his other Middle Eastern challenges, and we'll wind up by saying that the somewhat grandiose plans he had for a Middle East settlement when he first came in have diminished a bit, and where we go from here remains to be seen. That having been said, let me start off with, I think, an almost axiom of American politics. When a new president of a new party comes in after the previous president has been in office for 8 years, that new president wants to make things appear different. For example, when George W. Bush came in, and I remember I had the pleasure of addressing the council the year after he came in, he tried to differentiate himself from Clinton. If you remember how tightly Clinton was involved in the Middle East peace process, convening Camp David II, when he was leaving office, pushing the Clinton parameters for an Arab-Israeli settlement, all of which failed, unfortunately. And Bush, when he came in, said, no, I'm not going to do that. So he took several steps back away from getting heavily involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he remained, except episodically, somewhat removed from the conflict until 9/11. There was a burst of emphasis, and then a few more times. But by the end of his tenure in office, not a lot of progress other than at Annapolis, a few photo ops. The peace process hadn't moved. So now, from the point of view of Barack Obama, he's going to demonstrate that he is not George W. Bush. Whereas Bush had gotten rid of all the special ambassadors to the Middle East, starting with Dennis Ross in the Middle East peace process. Obama appoints 3 of them, one for Afghanistan, one for Iran, and one, George Mitchell, for the Arab-Israeli conflict. He also, from day one, gets heavily involved. He makes it very clear what he wants. Two-state solution for the Middle East, end of Israeli building of settlements, moving ahead for a total Arab-Israeli peace plan. Now, it sounds wonderful, but what happened? And let me get into this now. The first, shall we say, stumbling block on the Obama campaign for Middle East peace occurs in February 10th of this year. And that's when elections are held in Israel, right after Operation Cast Lead, where the Israelis went into Gaza to try to stop the rocket and mortar attacks on Israeli communities in southern Israel, the coming out of Gaza. He wins the election, at least. The election moves the Israeli populace right. What Obama didn't quite understand, maybe he's beginning to understand it now, was in fact how right of center the Israeli public has moved. The basic axiom that Netanyahu was arguing, which was, look, we withdrew from Lebanon and instead of peace, we got rocket fire. We withdrew from Gaza and instead of peace, we got rocket fire. Let's be very careful before any more withdrawals on the West Bank because we'll be hit with rocket and mortar fire again. And this was the basic argument that he made, and it was pretty successful in the campaign. He was able to forge a coalition which was basically a right-of-center coalition with the Labor Party, whose leader, Ehud Barak, wanted to stay on as defense minister. And that gave Mr. Netanyahu a little bit of cover from the left, so he could call it right-of-center rather than a right-wing coalition. But right off the bat, I totaled up no fewer than 10 different areas of, I won't say confrontation, I will say difference of opinion between the Obama administration and Netanyahu. And they go something like this. Number one, and we'll possibly see something on this tomorrow, how to handle Iran. Diplomacy, if so, for how long, or force, and if so, by whom, Israel or the United States. Number two, a two-state solution to the Arab-Israeli, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On this one, initially, Netanyahu opposed a two-state solution. Obama very much pushed for one. Number three, what to do about Israeli settlements and settlement outposts. Number four, in case Hamas and the Palestinian Authority of Mr. Mahmoud Abbas ever got together, they had been split since 2007, what policy would the United States take toward this reunification? Support it or not? Needless to say, Netanyahu opposed that. Number five, Jerusalem. Is it going to be the capital of one state or two states? Number six, the Arab peace plan, first raised in 2002, later resurrected in 2007. How much of that could be implemented? Number eight, security checkpoints which the Israelis use on the West Bank to prevent terrorism in the Israeli point of view. How many were needed? How many could be abolished? Number nine, the devolution of security responsibility on the West Bank from the Israeli army to Palestinian Authority forces. And number 10, and a very sensitive issue, construction materials allowed into Gaza for rebuilding after the war. Would they be used to rebuild houses, or would they be used to rebuild Hamas bunkers? That was a difference of opinion as to the sending of concrete. So right off the bat then, Mr. Obama and Mr. Netanyahu tended to look at the world a little differently. Now, this is not the first time in American history such a thing has happened. I draw your attention back to the first Netanyahu term, 1996 to 1999, and where he came into a confrontation with Mr. Clinton. Now, if you recall, at that time, settlements were an issue, Jerusalem was an issue, some of the same, but not all the same issues. But the difference then was Mr. Netanyahu had some protection. At that time, there was a Republican Congress. Newt Gingrich was in power. Tom DeLay was in power, and they gave Netanyahu a certain kind of protection vis-a-vis the President of the United States. This is different now, though. Strong Democratic Congress, which gives, at least in theory, strong backing to Mr. Obama. And also something else different this time, instead of the usual strong AIPAC pro-Israeli lobby, there's now a JPAC lobby of more left-of-center, peace-oriented Jews who are pushing the peace process. So you have a different kind of situation, which made initially it look like Obama would be able to push things through. Now, let me now turn to Obama's view of the world, the Obama approach to foreign affairs, so to speak. He believes in engagement, sort of the basic assumption that if the U.S. drops its confrontational policy and is willing to talk to adversaries, the adversaries will meet the United States halfway. What he clearly set out to do, in my view, was to change the tone of foreign policy and change the mood. And in this he succeeded, at least as far as the Norwegians are concerned, because they gave him the Nobel Prize. Has he moved, however, to get substantive changes in the policies of our adversaries? North Korea, Syria, Iran, I could go down, Venezuela, I could go down the list. Not yet. Again, we'll see tomorrow as far as Iran is concerned. Now, what about the Obama approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict? A clear move initially to quell anti-Americanism in the Muslim world and in the Arab world, and outreaches in Turkey and in Cairo. Second goal was to improve relations with Syria, and there were three goals there. Facilitate an Israeli-Syrian peace agreement. That's the top of the list. A strong American-Syrian relationship will help convince the Syrians to settle on reasonable terms with Israel. Perhaps more important tactically, the second goal was to split Syria away from Iran. And number three, since the offices of Hamas happen to be located in Damascus, to try to get the Syrians to pressure Hamas to make peace with Israel, or at least make peace with Fatah. So that's the first goal. Second goal was to move, or policy was an outreach to Iran to get it to stop enriching uranium, that we're all familiar with. Because if it stops enriching uranium and gets very, very tight International Atomic Energy, IAEA, supervision with surprise inspections, which aren't there now, it's less likely for an Israeli attack on these nuclear installations, let alone an American one, and an Israeli attack would complicate U.S. policy. Number three, as far specifically as the Arab-Israeli conflict, a push of Netanyahu for the two-state solution, a strong push to stop building settlements. Now, we talk about settlements, there are four things you have to know. There are settlement outposts, sometimes a kilometer or even a mile away from a settlement itself, Jewish settlement on the West Bank. And they have a habit of growing to each other, thereby grabbing up land that Palestinians want for their own state. There's also the question of the E1 corridor, which goes from Jerusalem to a major Israeli city on the West Bank called Ma'ale Adumim. And finally, there's a question of East Jerusalem. Who owns it? Who can build there? So it's all kind of linked in here. This is what he wanted. As far as the Palestinians were concerned, at least those on the West Bank on whom the Americans had some influence, there was a desire to crack down on the terrorists, on Hamas in particular, and of course Abbas had a lot of incentive to do that because Hamas was his main opponent, but also, and very important, to resume negotiations with Israel. Once Abbas had heard that the Israelis were being told by the United States, you have to stop building settlements, Abbas said, okay, I'm going to wait till Mr. Obama delivers the Israelis, no negotiations with the Israelis until they stop building settlements. And number three, as far as the Arab world itself, what Mr. Obama wanted to do was get them to make some gestures to the Israelis, what we call in political science confidence-building measures. And that would encourage the Israelis to be more forthcoming in the peace process if they thought that this would lead to peace, not just with the Palestinians, but with the entire Arab world. And some of these confidence-building measures were as follows: letting Israeli planes fly through their airspaces, Israelis being allowed to open offices there, visas to Israeli businessmen and tourists, direct telephone connections, and high-level meetings with senior Israeli officials. That was the plan. What happened to the plan? Well, in the presence of Mubarak, the president of Egypt, in the middle of August, the president of the United States frankly stated that, and I'm quoting now, the peace process was in a rut. And one could argue it's remained in a rut ever since. Why did this happen? And let me tick off the reasons. Number one, the Palestinians. In the case of the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas, he decided to sit back and let Obama deliver the Israelis by, as I mentioned, demanding the full stop to the settlement construction. And he got the Fatah Congress, which hadn't met for a very long time, but met in August of this year, to endorse that demand. So sort of painting himself in a corner. Number two, the rift between Hamas and Fatah continued despite very strong Egyptian efforts to heal the breach. And unless the two get together to forge one Palestinian policy, it's unlikely there's ever going to be an Israeli-Palestinian peace. Number three, the Arab world, at least publicly, has not been forthcoming on the confidence-building measures. And let me quote Saudi Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal, who stated in Washington in late July, and I quote, "Temporary security, confidence-building measures will not bring peace. What is required is a comprehensive approach that defines the final outcome at the outset and launches into negotiations over final status issues such as borders, Jerusalem, water, refugees, and security." So not big on confidence-building measures. Well, let's see what else has happened. There's been a payoff for the outreach to Syria. Remember, they want to break Syria from Iran, get Syria to pressure Hamas, etc. Well, the United States announced in July it was sending its ambassador back. And Special Envoy Mitchell said that this will be done to, quote, facilitate a truly comprehensive Middle East peace. And you should remember that as a result of Operation Cast Lead, Syria had broken off its indirect negotiations with Israel on a peace agreement that had been mediated by Turkey. By August, the U.S. is even lifting some, but not all, of the sanctions against Syria, again, hoping to encourage it to move forward. But what has been the result? Syrian behavior. Hosting Mr. Chavez, who in Damascus bitterly denounced the United States. Number two, praising the election victory of Ahmadinejad, quote, as a great event and a great lesson for foreigners. And if I may further note what Assad said, the main reason for the West's interference is to block Iran and Syria's frequent victories. I'm confident that the re-election of the president by the Iranian nation is a confirmation that Iran and Syria must continue their past policies in the region. Does that strike you as Syria being broken away from Iran? Also, no evidence, at least that I've seen, of pressure by the Syrians to get Hamas to reconcile with Fatah. All right, what about Iran? What's happened on that front? And again, Iran is kind of critical in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Although there's no specific territorial disputes, Iran is the main backer of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has proved a threat to Israel. They fought a war in 2006, and also to Hamas, and they just fought a war a few months ago. Has this borne fruit? Again, up until the last week, not a lot, and it remains to be seen about tomorrow, but let me just look at what the Obama policy had been. 2 letters to the Iranian leadership asking for improved relations. And during the period when there were public disturbances against the fixed election, the President of the United States took an extremely low profile, raising questions here and abroad about Obama's commitment to human rights. Then when you look at the response finally that the Iranians gave, this was before the revelation of the hidden centrifuge plant at Qom, they said the following: we need to restructure the world order and the IAEA, national sovereignty must be respected, and the Palestinian rights must be championed. No response to the American goal to stop them from enriching. All right, what about Plan B? Well, if the Iranians don't come through, sanctions. Well, the U.S. has leaned over backwards to get the Russians and the Chinese to go along with sanctions, serious sanctions, not the first 3 sets of sanctions, which have been more or less a slap on the wrist. We've heard Mr. Medvedev sort of say that maybe under some circumstances sanctions would be possible, but Putin, who has the real power in Moscow, said, no, we have a good relationship with the Iranians. Similarly, the Chinese, We get a lot of their oil from Iran as well. So not a lot of movement. Ironically, the only movement, not a lot of movement, but the only movement to meet some of the goals of Obama came from the Israelis. Number one, Netanyahu approved a two-state solution, which is something he had long opposed. He said this in a major speech at a religious university, Bar Ilan in Israel. And this was a signal, I think, to some of the religious settlers on the West Bank. They've got to prepare themselves mentally for a two-state solution. So he's willing to use some of his political capital there. Number two, he also put out the word he would be willing to have a temporary settlement halt and then see if the settlement halt brings movement in the peace process, then perhaps we can move the peace process forward. However, he qualified that by continuing to build in the West Bank and Jerusalem, which raised some questions in Palestinian minds and American minds as to just how serious he was. But to improve Palestinian life on the West Bank, he has lifted a number of Israeli checkpoints, and the Palestinian economy has been growing at a 7% GNP rate, albeit from a relatively low level. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are Jewish in the audience, but I have to tell one story here, if I may, which I think underlines the point I'm trying to make tonight. Now, we're a long way away from Passover, which is a major Jewish holiday of liberation from Egypt. And one of the songs that Jews sing on Passover is something called Dayenu, which means it would have been enough. If God had taken the Jews out of Egypt, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If he had taken us out of Egypt and not given us the Sabbath, it would have been enough. If he had not given us, if he'd given us the Sabbath but not given us the Torah, it would have been enough, and so forth and so on. So in this case, for Obama, it's not that he just had problems in the Middle East while all this was going on. He had a lot of problems elsewhere, domestically, health care. Turned out to be a nightmare for him. He sort of backed off during the summer, letting the Republicans take command, and you heard government control, busting the budget, death panels, and so forth. And it's not clear as of today, given the vote on reimbursing doctors, whether he's regained the initiative there. Number two, his deficit plan. Is it working? Is it not working? Are we stimulating the economy? A lot of unemployment. That's always a central issue for any American. And this is just domestic policy, folks. Foreign policy. Afghanistan became very, very, very serious. He fired one general, Mr. McKiernan, replaced him with Mr. McChrystal. McChrystal's asked for 40,000 to 60,000 more troops. And the Obama administration has been weighing this and weighing this and weighing this. And I have to emphasize that these issues, health care, the budget, the deficit, Afghanistan, take a huge amount of presidential time. Dr. Byrd and I were discussing this prior to the lecture. We discussed you have a lot of task forces working on this, but ultimately the president has to invest some presidential time. And with Afghanistan looming, the health care looming, how much time does he really have to deal with the Middle East? It's an open question. What about Iraq? The goal is to move American troops out of Iraq and into Afghanistan. But this depends on a successful election. And the Iraqis still haven't passed the election law. And the relations between Sunni and Shia may be a mite better, but between Arabs on the one side and Kurds on the other are not. That's a problem. North Korea, testing missiles and announced further nuclear enrichment. Outstretched hand of Mr. Obama didn't seem to work there. Venezuela, also an outstretched hand. Continuing to escalate anti-Americanism against the United States. And if that weren't enough, there's a new government in Japan that you may have been reading about that's going to stop the refueling of American ships in the Indian Ocean, and now there's raised the question about the American base on Okinawa. And if that weren't enough, when you add all of this together, while Obama was certainly personally popular initially in the Arab and Muslim worlds, no question. My wife and I traveled to Egypt this summer and did some interviews, and it's very clear how popular Obama had become. In Israel, his popularity rate just fell and fell and fell, and this is probably a mistake. He talked to the Turks, he talked to the Egyptians, he talked to the Muslims. He never took the time to talk to the Israelis, and I think that turned out to be a mistake. In any case, by August, certainly by early September, it was clear that the American position had changed. Number one, instead of a full settlement stop, an apparent willingness to negotiate a temporary settlement freeze with Netanyahu. Number two, to salvage something out of the peace process, the U.S. pressured Abbas into meeting with Netanyahu at the UN, but I think the term photo op best describes that incident. Number three has been an attempt to build up Abbas's position as the Palestinian Authority elections in 2010, either in January or June, they're still negotiating that, will take place. A number of funding efforts for projects to build up the economy on the West Bank, encouraging the further easing of Israeli security efforts, and that's happened. However, from the point of view of Mahmoud Abbas, the fiasco over the Goldstone report, first postponing it and then bringing it forward, has undermined his popularity, if not his legitimacy. Now, what does the U.S. come down to? I think it's an endorsement of at least part of Salam Fayyad's two-year plan. Fayyad is the prime minister, to create a Palestinian state. Build up the economy, build up the state, and we'll see what happens. Also, I think it's been very clear, if there was an initial interest in talking to Hamas at the beginning of the administration, as some people speculated, that certainly dropped off as the political capital of Mr. Obama has lessened. Indeed, during the most recent talks, when it looked like there might be a final agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority to hold new elections and jointly control the West Bank and Gaza, the U.S. made it very, very clear that Hamas had to satisfy the three demands of the quartet, diplomatic quartet, the UN, the EU, Russia, and the United States, to recognize Israel, renounce terrorism, and accept all previous agreements between the Palestinians and Israel. All right, so what can we conclude from all this? I think, or at least I've tried to make this pretty clear, after a very, very ambitious start in which the President of the United States, Barack Obama, hoped to win over the Muslim world, to convince Iran to stop nuclear enrichment, to split Syria from Iran, and jumpstart the Arab-Israeli conflict by getting the Israelis to stop building settlements and getting the Arabs to agree to confidence-building measures. Obama, because of the realities of the Middle East and problems elsewhere in the world, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, North Korea, as well as domestic problems, has scaled back his ambitions to a temporary settlement freeze and emphasis on statehood from the Palestinians, if only on the West Bank. Now, whether or not he will achieve this goal remains to be seen. And I draw everybody's attention to George Mitchell, who's the U.S. Special Envoy. He's due to meet with the President very soon to give his evaluation, and Mrs. Clinton's going to give her evaluation, and they seem to be working as a team. And we'll see if there's going to be any movement in the peace process after that, or whether the President will decide, you know, that's a tough nut to crack. Let me concentrate on health care. Let me get the things straight in Afghanistan. Let's move the process along a little bit more in Iraq. Then we'll come back to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And on that happy note, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.
Well, as always, most interesting. Thank you very much. Floor is open for questions. The question is, would you comment on the Goldstone report?
Yeah. I don't know how many of you saw, I actually had an editorial yesterday in The Sun. For those of you who still read The Sun, it's not the glory days that it used to be. Basically, the Goldstone report has a number of I think, serious weaknesses. To summarize them very quickly, number one, it comes out of the UN Human Rights Council, which has a long record of being nastily anti-Israel. So bad, in fact, that former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan publicly reproached them in 2006 for its one-sided attention to Israel, and his successor did it again in 2007. Some of the members of the commission who did the investigating, one is a collector of Nazi memorabilia, another one right in the middle of the war, while the war is still going on, publicly said Israel's responsible. So this raises serious questions, number one. Number two, if you look through all 530 pages of the report, you find some very interesting things, one of which complaints about Israel destroying Bedouin houses in the Negev desert. Now, you could raise a very serious question about illegal houses built by Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Israelis, whichever term you want to use, in the Negev. What does that have to do with the fighting of Operation Cast Lead? And the report goes on and on like this, try to castigating Israel up and down the line. The final censure, if you count them up, there are 9 elements of censure for Israel and 2 for Hamas. That gives you a kind of idea of the imbalance. The bottom line, though, in the Goldstone report, and again, you can get my editorial online if you want, and you can also get the Goldstone report online, just download it from the UN Human Rights Committee. The bottom line leaves it out of context. The Israelis just didn't go into Gaza. They had absorbed 8,000 mortar and rocket attacks into southern Israel, making life really, really, really unpleasant, in some places unlivable for the Israelis. And I've been in some of the places where the rockets fell during the summer. That part was, shall we say, played way down by the report. The context was taken out. The other problem with the report is, and I used to be an Army officer, U.S. infantry officer, so we were trained on this. You always have to worry about mission and men anytime you're involved in a military conflict. And when you're fighting in urban areas, which is very difficult to start with, and then you have guerrilla forces fighting behind civilians, it makes it even more difficult. So you have to ask, and this is the moral question, who bears the greater onus? Those who use civilians effectively as shields to fight at the Israelis, or the Israelis who try to root them out to stop the rocket and mortar attacks into Israel proper. Anyway, that in a nutshell is my view.
Would you comment upon Israel's humanitarian efforts?
Okay, the Israelis have taken in, starting in the 70s under Mr. Begin, also a maligned Israeli prime minister, Vietnamese boat people. They're taking in Darfur people. But that really skirts the issue. The issue is the Palestinian refugee issue is a central final status issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It can't be avoided. The dilemma when you're dealing with the refugee issue is this. The narratives are so different as to why the refugees became refugees. All right? The Palestinian narrative, and I put that word in quotes, is the Israelis, by terrorism, drove everybody out. The Israeli narrative is, look, we wanted them to stay, but their leaders told them to leave. My analysis of that is much more complicated, as you might think. I don't know if any of my students are here hiding somewhere, but they may have heard this before. But anyway, first off, there was an overall atmosphere of terror. And if there's an atmosphere of terror, people get out of there so they don't get killed. The Jews had no place to go, the Arabs did. That's first and foremost. Secondly, there were, in fact, cases where the Israelis expelled Palestinians, Lud and Ramla in particular. And the problem there was, again, it's a moral, difficult issue. You have the Egyptian army coming up from the south, the Jordanian army coming down from the north. You've got rather narrow lines, and you've got 100,000 Arabs behind your lines. They could be fifth columnists. What do? Well, the decision was made to expel them. Okay, so some left by expulsion, most left to get out of the way of the terror. And the Palestinian Arab community was not well organized in 1948. How do you solve it? Mr. Clinton came up with something called the Clinton parameters when he left office in the year 2000, which Arafat should have accepted but didn't. What it called was a symbolic number of the refugees who returned to Israel. The vast majority of the refugees who wanted to come back would go to the Palestinian state, West Bank, Gaza state, and there would be compensation. When you're talking about Palestinian refugees, you're really talking about the worst case situation is those in Lebanon. About 350,000, they're barred from virtually every possible job, can't own land, can't get good jobs, et cetera. 12 refugee camps don't live very well. These 350,000 have to be number one goal to move back to a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. The case of Jordan, which is the opposite element as far as how refugees are treated. They have Jordanian citizenship. How many will leave? How many come back? It's not clear, and the Syrian case is somewhat in the middle. But that's my view.
Two different questions. One, would you comment upon the phenomenon of Israeli spies in the United States? And secondly, deal with the give your estimate of the necessity of using a military strike.
Okay, on the first, everybody spies on everybody. This is the U.S. spies, trust me. Again, I used to be in the military, U.S. military. We spy on the Israelis, we spy on a lot of other people, they spy on us, sometimes people get caught. It's just the nature of things. And that's in the modern world, people spy. In the other question about the facilities, you have a fusion plant in Iraq, you've got a centrifuge plant in Natanz, and you've got the reactor at Bushehr. These are the three major targets. Now, these are hittable by the Israelis if they should decide to do it. Now, there have been a lot of studies, most recent one by a friend of mine from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Tony Korsman, who's a really good analyst. So I invite you to look at those. It is doable with planes being refueled, and the Israelis have practiced refueling in the Mediterranean. I mean, that's been done. It will be dangerous. Planes will be shot down. Now, the joker in this is if Russia provides SAM surface-to-air missile 300s to Iran, which can engage the Israeli planes as far as 200 kilometers out. Once the Israeli, and that's why the Israelis have been fighting so hard to prevent the Russians from doing this, even agreeing to go to Moscow for an international peace conference in an effort to prevent this. If those are ever in the process of being deployed, the Israelis, I'm convinced, will strike before they're deployed.
The observation was that the idea of having clear-cut endpoints is helpful in diplomacy. Your comments.
Well, ideally, this is exactly right. This is exactly what the Clinton parameters laid out. The Israelis in 2000 accepted them. Arafat, thinking he would get a better deal with George Bush than he had with Clinton, rejected it, and the end result we all know. Oh, absolutely. I agree. You need to have clear endpoints. The question is, how do you get from point A to these endpoints? And the whole reason why the Obama administration pushed for these confidence-building measures, these CBMs, was to encourage the Israelis that, hey, if you reach agreement on A, B, C, D, E, there are going to be real benefits at the end. The way the peace plan originated by Saudi Arabia in 2002 and endorsed by most of the other Arabs works, once Israelis withdraw from all the occupied territories from 67, there will be diplomatic relations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Israelis say, well, we have to do everything up front, and then maybe at the end of the process, the Saudis and the others will agree to diplomatic relations with us. The idea of confidence-building measures along the way, though, was, okay, Israel takes a few steps, Arabs reward the Israelis for the steps they're taking, which means the Israelis are a little bit more confident, hence confidence-building measures, that at the end of the game, when they finish their withdrawal, there really will be full diplomatic relations. I think that's the main point there.
Would you comment upon Turkish-Israeli relations?
Yeah, there's been a whirlwind change in Turkish-Israeli relations. No question about it. It's not just starting with Operation Cast Lead, it was there before. The bottom line on Turkish-Israeli relations goes something like this. They signed a defensive alliance in 1996. At the time, the secular government of Turkey was in a real conflict with Syria. And from the Turkish point of view, having Israel as an ally could squeeze the Syrians. And that worked, because in 1998, when they actually mobilized on Syria's border to get the Syrians to stop supporting the PKK, the Kurdish terrorists, the Syrians had to give in and kick Öcalan, who's the head of the PKK, out of the country. The other main reason that the Israelis and the Turks were warm was because had good relations was because the Armenian issue keeps coming up in the United States. And the Turks very much wanted to use the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby, made up of different elements, with the Turkish lobby to counterbalance the Armenian lobby. So these were the two things. Now, this all began to change when the AKP party of Mr. Erdogan was elected. And it's an Islamist party, make no bones about it, and is very strong Islamist constituency. The problem from Mr. Erdogan's point of view is the two things that his Islamist constituency wanted the most, that is to allow women to wear headscarves to go to universities and enter government buildings. He's not been able to push that one through. And he's not been able to get specialized admission procedures for graduates of religious high schools into Turkish colleges. So he's had to lean over backwards to try to satisfy his Islamist constituency. Well, one way he did it, of course, was inviting Hamas delegations on a regular basis, even though the Hamas has sworn to destroy Israel. Needless to say, this is way before this latest thing happened. Then comes Operation Cast Lead, the war in Gaza, and Erdogan is very emotional, saying, you're killing Muslims, etc. Now, we'll put aside for a minute the number of Kurds the Turkish troops have killed in southeast Turkey and the fact that he invited Bashir, the head of Sudan, to Turkey, and he's got 200,000 to 300,000 deaths on his record, and he's an honored guest in Turkey. Talk about hypocrisy, but of course diplomacy and hypocrisy sometimes go together. This having been said, this really began to sour relations, but now what's happened in those two issues? Turkey has warm relations with Syria, very, very much. They're now abolishing visas between the two. So the Turks don't need Israel against Syria. And now the Turks have opened and have an opening to the Armenians. They've just signed an agreement with Armenia. Now, whether it gets ratified in the Armenian legislature and the Turkish legislature, because it tends to alienate the Azerbaijanis, who are allies of Turkey, remains to be seen. But the two central issues of Turkish-Israeli relations aren't there anymore. So it allowed Erdogan to pander more to his domestic constituency, which he's doing now. Long run remains to be seen. The Army is far less strong than it used to be. In the old days, the Army would have vetoed this kind of thing, as it did in 1997 when the previous Islamist regime was in. We'll see. The Turkish ambassadors come back to Israel. Maybe this will blow over. I have my doubts. I think there's a total reorientation of Turkish foreign policy going on. Maybe we should have the Turkish ambassador here one day to come talk about it.
Would you, if there is an attack upon the Iranian nuclear facilities, what might follow? What are your scenarios?
Well, there basically been two major scenarios. The Iranians claim they're going to close the Straits of Hormuz, with which two-thirds of the world's oil lies there. The U.S. will then open the Straits of Hormuz. There's no love lost between the Sunni Arabs and the Sunni Arab leadership in the Iranian regime. So you're not going to get a lot of government support for the Iranians if the Israelis attack, that's for sure. The Iranians have tried to undercut the governments of the Sunni Arab world by being the leaders on the Palestinian issue, to sort of get the Arab street. We're the champions of the Palestinians. Whether this will cause mass uprisings against the governments, I have my doubts. Remember, the Sunni Arabs call it the Arab Gulf. The Persians call it the Persian Gulf, okay? It sort of gives you a feel for the problem. There's also the Sunni-Shia issue. So you're not going to see a lot of movement there. What you're probably going to see is a rise in oil prices. But the problem here is that if they try to close the Gulf, this is going to bring them in direct confrontation with the United States. And they can only do that once, because after that, the U.S. will use major force against them. So you want to save that probably, and whether this is the best time for that confrontation with the U.S. or not, especially if the U.S. isn't involved, then only the Israelis do it. The third question, and one that some of us who are involved in dealing with Iranian affairs are now actively debating, is will the Iranian people rally around the Iranian government if this happens? Now, prior to the fraudulent elections of June 12th, there seemed to be a consensus among most Iranian specialists that they would rally. Now it's not clear at all. The rather strong brutality used by the Iranian regime has alienated a lot of people, and given the close personal identification of Ahmadinejad and Khamenei, the supreme religious leader, with the nuclear program, weakening the nuclear program might be seen as more as a weakening of those SOBs who are running the country than a weakening of Iranian power. And we just don't know that yet. The danger, if I may say it, of the Obama policy of outreach to Iran and the Iranian leadership, and I understand what they want to do is they want to stop the nuclear enrichment, is that you're legitimizing basically an illegitimate regime, jailing people, murdering people, raping people, all at government behest. And whether this is desirable or not is an open question.
Would you comment on the relationship between Netanyahu and the right in Israel and how that dynamic affects the peace process?
Okay, he comes from the Likud party, and the Likud party is the second largest in parliament, only one shy of Kadima. Within the Likud party, there is a strong right-wing faction. In addition to that, you have smaller parties in the coalition, especially Jewish Home, which is really the base of, it's got just a few people, very loud, and it's the base of the settlement movement. On the other side, there are some moderates in Likud, Dan Meridor being the most conspicuous representative of that, plus people like Barak and Labor, which is against it. So basically what you have here is you have a right-of-center regime, and Netanyahu is very cleverly playing on the two mistakes that were made first by Labor and Barak by pulling out of Lebanon without a peace agreement and getting rockets in return, as I mentioned, and Kadima under Sharon of pulling out of Gaza instead of getting peace. There's almost an Israeli consensus. Let's be very careful and not withdraw anymore because we'll get rockets on Jerusalem, rockets on Ben Gurion Airport, rockets on Tel Aviv. And that's the core base that he's working on. So his hard line resonates with the Israelis given their experience of the last 8 or 9 years. See, that's the point. So it's marrying now. He came out and agreed to a Palestinian state. Now, this is a change in Likud ideology. Likud ideology, remember, started as both banks of the Jordan. Where the current state of Jordan is, that's ours, at least as far as Amman. They gave that up. Then they've given up by saying a two-state solution, giving up all the West Bank. Now the issue is just how much of the West Bank is going to be up there. And that's the mistake that Mahmoud Abbas made, is not negotiating on this point, because he might find Netanyahu more willing to negotiate than otherwise. I have to tell you, I had the pleasure of meeting Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah a few years ago. And very unlike the head of the Palestinian Authority, very much unlike Arafat. We had a meeting. When I met Arafat, he was invariably 2 hours late, comes in not cleanly dressed. Mahmoud Abbas comes in, jacket, tie, right at 7 o'clock when the meeting was. Very much with it. His heart is in the right place, but he's weak. And that's the problem. Arafat wasn't weak, but he didn't want to deliver. I think Abbas is weak, and he does want to deliver. And you have that part of the equation on one side, and Netanyahu leading a group of Israelis are very wary about any further withdrawals unless they're reassured. And you don't have a lot of room there to move the peace process forward, which requires, of course, a strong role by the United States. But as I mentioned earlier, the President of the United States has a few other worries right now.
Would you comment on the press reports that the United States Air Force would oppose an Israeli strike?
You know, there are press reports and press reports. I rather prefer to see what's actually happening on the ground. As we sit here for the lecture, Israeli planes and American planes and Israeli missile defense forces and American missile defense forces are actively cooperating together in a joint exercise. So I wouldn't put a lot of credence into what you read. The issue is something like this. It would not be in the interest of the United States, some people argue, for the Israelis to hit the Iranian nuclear facilities. That's one argument of one group. On the other hand, there are those who say, well, if the Israelis can do it, we give them the bunker-busting bombs, we can have clean hands and say we're not involved. because the danger of an Iran with nuclear weapons is just too great, and that kind of regime cannot be deterred the way the Soviet Union was. So, I mean, there are two schools of thought at war, literally, in Washington over what to do. Secretary of Defense Gates belongs to the first school, doesn't want this to happen. Others, take the other position. And I think between the United States and Israel, where the agreement was recently was Israel agreed, okay, we will give till the end of December 2009 for the U.S. and Iran to work something out. If it works, fine. Otherwise, we're going to have to take action. And the thing to watch here is if it makes the press, whether or not the most recently developed modernized bunker-busting bombs are sold from the United States to Israel. That's going to be the test.
Do you envision the possibility of a joint capital in Jerusalem?
Well, I think it's possible. I think if you're looking at a solution for Jerusalem, you're looking at really three things. First of all, how to divvy up the municipal area. Okay. Number two, how do you deal with things like sewage, electricity, all the infrastructure things? And most important of all, how you deal with the Temple Mount / Haram al-Sharif. Because the dilemma is, as I think everybody in this room knows, up on the old Temple Mount where the first two Jewish temples were, now reside the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. And one of the supporting walls of that is the western wall, the last remnant of the temple. And how do you divide this? I have an answer to this, which I will give you since you were kind enough to ask. I think what you have to do is internationalize the holy places in Jerusalem. That means the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Haram, and the Western Wall. Put them under 4 or 5 people, including the Israelis, the Palestinians, Jordanians, Saudis to give it religious legitimacy, and the United States to give for the Americans. Once you come and can agree to that, then it's possible. The problem is people have very long memories. Look, if I were a Muslim, here's my memory, okay? During the Crusades, the Christians came and they seized the Dome of the Rock and they made it into a church with a big gold cross on top. They took Al-Aqsa Mosque and they made it into a stable, okay? We can't let that happen again. If you're Jews, you say, look, at difficulty we could worship at the Western Wall. And between 1948 and 1967, the Jordanians wouldn't let us worship there, okay? So you've got that phenomenon where both sides really have long historical memories. So you've got to internationalize it, make it an international religious museum. Actually, the first person to come up with that idea was David Ben-Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel, back in 1937 when he was testifying before the Peel Commission when the British still had the country.
Would you comment upon the estimates of when Iran might get a weapon and what implications that has?
All right, as you might expect, there are two different views on this. The Israelis think the weapon will be within a year. The U.S., 3 years. The British and French sooner. So there's a difference between the American position, the British and French position, as well as the Israeli position on this. The estimates now, nobody wants to politicize intelligence, to be sure. But in November of 2007, the National Intelligence Estimate came out with what I thought was the wrong decision, saying the Iranians had stopped weaponizing uranium back in 2003. Now, to put together a bomb, you need 3 things. You need the enriched uranium, you need the missiles to deliver it, and you need the means of taking the uranium and sticking it on a warhead. If they stopped at all, they didn't stop their missiles. They didn't stop the enrichment process. Well, they may have done, and now the U.S. is questioning that with high confidence. That was a term used in the report, stop the enrichment. Now, a lot of people are saying they've started the weaponization program again, and the problem in the Iranian case is the Iranians have not answered IAEA questions, number one. Even El-Baradei, the head of the IAEA, has demanded answers which they haven't gotten. And number two, they do not allow SNAP inspections under the additional protocol, which they said they were going to sign back in 2005, but never did. So there's a lot of evidence they're hiding things. And the most recent example of that was Qom, where suddenly another centrifuge plant in Qom. Now, apologists for Iran have argued, well, they're afraid the Israelis are going to bomb the big one at Natanz, therefore they needed this one. But since it was in a military base, and protected by Republican Guard troops, one has to think it may be a military-related. And October 25th is when the IAEA is supposed to visit that. We'll see. But anyway, to make a very long story short, your estimates here are between a year and 3. Now, if in fact they get rid of 85% of their uranium, enriched uranium, which according to this agreement that was reached, which the Iranians, the U.S., et cetera, have to agree to formally tomorrow, that will take some of the punch out of their ability to make bombs, unless, of course, they've enriched it elsewhere and hidden it. And even if this works, they can just go on enriching. They'll have within a year, and now they're adding P1, now P2 centrifuges, more and more sophisticated ones. So this will be a very temporary respite.
The question is, in case of an attack upon their nuclear strength in Iran, is there a chance that they might use conventional weapons against Israel?
There are two kinds of possible responses. One would be firing their Shihab-3 missiles, which already have the capability of hitting Israel, and that probably would definitely happen, as well as attempts possibly to close the strait, but that would get them involved with the United States. The other thing would be for them to urge Hezbollah and Hamas to launch attacks from Lebanon and from Gaza. Now, the question is, with all the loss of life in the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah and the 2008-2009 war between Israel and Hamas, will Hamas and will Hezbollah want to risk once again taking on the Israelis? Maybe less so than they would have before. And one of the Iranian critiques that I have read about both wars is these guys shot off their missiles before they should have, when we would have needed them. So now Hezbollah is still worried about its position in Lebanon. And, you know, getting involved in one more war, they just lost the election they didn't think they were going to lose, might destroy that position. And Hamas remains to be seen.
Well, one could imagine having drinks for everybody and making this a night with Professor Freedman. However, our norm is that we make it a mere evening, and thank him for an absolutely wonderful time.
Thank you.